anger. And I thought, why is this? Well, it's a sort of boy. I thought it was an old man was probably.
The internal war for the soul of the monarchy has just taken a sharp, legal turn that no one expected. While the nation watched Prince William's administrative purge, a quiet, seismic shift has occurred behind the scenes involving the Queen's private estate. Lady Louise Windsor has reportedly come forward with documentation claiming a stake in a historic property, one long considered the personal inheritance of the Queen's own family. As word of this claim reaches the inner circle, Camilla's relatives have erupted in open defiance, threatening to take their grievances to the public. The battle for the crown is no longer just about management, it is now about bloodlines, inheritance, and a secret will that could dismantle the Queen's legacy overnight. The discovery. A document unearthed. The atmosphere inside the solicitor's office in London was sterile. It smelled of old paper and dust. Lady Louise Windsor sat across from the senior partner. He had spent 3 hours laying out the contents of a sealed envelope. It had been held in a secure vault since the passing of Queen Elizabeth II in 2022. The document was a private codicil. It had been tucked inside a larger collection of personal correspondence. It had remained hidden until an audit of the private estate assets began last month. The partner slid a photocopy across the polished mahogany table. He pointed to the final paragraph. It was written in the late Queen's distinct looping script. The text specified a lifetime tenancy for a cottage on the Balmoral estate. It was not one of the main residences. It was a smaller, more secluded property. It had been the site of some of the Queen's most private summers. The codicil stated that the property was to be granted to Lady Louise upon her graduation from university. The implications of the document were immediate. The property in question had been utilized by the staff connected to Queen Camilla for various administrative purposes over the last 4 years. The codicil did not acknowledge their usage. It treated the land as a direct, personal bequest to the granddaughter who had shared the Queen's quiet passion for carriage driving and the Scottish Highlands. The solicitor looked at Lady Louise and asked if she understood the legal weight of what she held. She looked at the document. She did not speak for a long time. She knew that asserting this claim would ignite a firestorm within the family. She had spent her entire life staying out of the headlines. She had worked a part-time job at a garden center to stay grounded. She had avoided the use of her HRH title. But this document was a direct instruction from her grandmother. It was a piece of history that she felt a duty to respect. The facts were blunt. The registration of this document in the Scottish Land Registry would force a legal confrontation. It would require the eviction of the current occupants. It would challenge the informal agreements that had been set in place by the King's household management. It would also force the issue of the Queen's private intent versus the administrative convenience of the current court. The tension in the office was palpable. The solicitor warned her that the King would be caught in the middle. He was the executor of the estate, but he was also the man who had overseen the integration of Camilla's family into the daily life of the palace. If he honored the codicil, he would be alienating his wife's relatives. If he ignored it, he would be violating the final, private will of his own mother. The mystery was why this document had not surfaced earlier. The archives had been searched multiple times since 2022. The solicitor suggested that it might have been misfiled by someone who was trying to keep it out of the public record. He did not say who, but the implication was clear. Someone had known about this cottage. Someone had wanted to keep it for their own use. Lady Louise stood up. She took the document. She told the solicitor that she would consider her options for 24 hours. She walked out into the busy London street. She felt the weight of the document in her bag. She was a 22-year-old woman who had just graduated. She was supposed to be starting a gap year of travel and volunteering. Instead, she was carrying a piece of paper that could dismantle the current peace of the House of Windsor. She walked toward the park. She saw the familiar sights of the city. She thought about the summers at Balmoral. She remembered the way her grandmother would talk about the land. It was not just an estate to the Queen. It was the place where she could breathe. It was the place where she was not just a monarch. Lady Louise realized that the cottage was a symbol. It was the only part of the Queen's private life that was never meant to be absorbed by the institution. The resolve in her heart hardened. She would not let the document disappear again. She would take the necessary steps to verify its authenticity. If the law stood behind her, she would claim what was rightfully hers. She did not want a war with the Queen's family, but she was not going to give up the last tangible connection to the woman she had admired more than anyone else in the world. The mystery shifted to the palace. Who had been using the cottage? Why were they so eager to keep it? The more she thought about it, the more she realized that this was not just about a building. It was about control. It was about the way the new household had been built on the foundations of the old. She had opened a door that had been firmly shut for 4 years. The light was coming in. The secrets were about to be revealed. The claim, Lady Louise Steps Forward. The official letter arrived at the king's private office on a Tuesday morning. It was not a phone call or a casual request. It was a formal legal notice delivered by a courier. The envelope was heavy, cream-colored, and sealed with wax. The contents were clear. Lady Louise was formally requesting the transfer of the cottage at Balmoral. She included a certified copy of the codicil. She gave the household 30 days to respond. The reception in the private office was chaotic. The king's secretary read the letter 3 times. He did not know how to categorize it. It was not a request from an external party. It was a claim from a member of the royal bloodline. The protocol for handling such a request did not exist. He placed the letter on the king's desk and backed out of the room. He felt the weight of the coming storm. Lady Louise was in Scotland when the letter reached the palace. She was staying at a small hotel near the estate. She did not want to be near the center of the noise. She spent her days walking the hills. She wanted to be sure of her decision before the reaction began. She was not seeking a confrontation. She was seeking the truth of her grandmother's final wishes. This was the first time in years that she had taken a public stand. She had watched the monarchy from the shadows. She had observed the way the institution had changed since the passing of the late queen. She had seen the way the new management had prioritized their own interests over the legacy of the past. She believed that this cottage was a piece of that legacy. She was not going to let it be erased. The facts were simple. The codicil was signed in the presence of 2 witnesses. It had been notarized. The document was legally sound. The king's legal team would have a hard time proving that it was not a valid expression of the late queen's intent. The struggle was not going to be legal. It was going to be political. It was going to be about who had the right to control the history of the house. Tension rose rapidly within the palace walls. The news of the claim reached the staff associated with the queen. They were the ones who had been using the cottage as a private retreat. They were the ones who had been enjoying the perks of the estate for 4 years. They saw the claim as an act of hostility. They began to lobby the queen to take a harder line. They told her that she could not let a member of the younger generation dictate the terms of her occupancy. A new mystery emerged by the afternoon. Who had informed the staff about the codicil? The news had leaked from the private office of the king to the staff lounge within an hour. Someone was deliberately trying to fuel the fire. Someone wanted the queen to know that her position was being challenged. The office of the prince was being monitored by the queen's own loyalists. The divide was now deep and permanent. Lady Louise received a call from an unknown number that evening. A voice told her that she was making a grave mistake. The voice said that the cottage was not worth the price of her standing in the family. It was a veiled threat. She did not hang up. She let the person speak. She wanted to know the depth of the resistance she was facing. She realized then that this was not about a building. The person on the other end of the line was a senior advisor to the queen. He was trying to intimidate her. He wanted to see if she would back down under pressure. He underestimated her resolve. Lady Louise told him that the letter was not a negotiation. It was a statement of fact. She hung up the phone and looked out at the hills. She knew that there was no turning back. The resolve in her posture was clear. She returned to the hotel. She began to prepare for the media response that was sure to follow. She knew that her every move would be scrutinized. She knew that she would be painted as the villain. She accepted that as the price of her action. She had spent years being the quiet, dutiful granddaughter. That role was over. The mystery deepened when she found a small gift left at her door. It was a book about the history of the Balmoral estate. There was no card. She opened it and found a note tucked into the pages. It was an old photograph of her and her grandmother in the garden of the cottage. It was a reminder of why she was doing this. Someone in the house was watching her. Someone was in her corner. She sat on the edge of the bed. She looked at the photograph. She realized that she was not alone. There were others in the house who felt the same way she did. There were others who were tired of the way the legacy was being managed. She had sparked a movement. She was the one who had finally spoken the truth. She was ready for the next move. The palace was already in an uproar. The king had called an emergency meeting. He had the letter in front of him. He was looking at the signature of his mother. He knew that he had to address this before it became a public spectacle. He had two paths. He could validate the claim and risk the anger of his wife, or he could block the claim and risk the fury of the public. He was running out of time. She stood up and walked to the window. The sky was turning dark. The wind was picking up over the hills. She felt a sense of clarity. She was doing what she believed was right. The consequences would be severe. The family would be fractured. But she would not be the one to break the silence. She had opened the door. The rest was up to the king. The uprising, Camilla's family. Responds. The dining room at the private residence was tense. Camilla's brother, Mark, paced the length of the rug. He held a glass of whiskey that he had not touched in 20 minutes. Across from him, the Queen's sister, Annabelle, sat in a high-backed chair. She was reading the copy of the legal notice again. Her face was tight. She had been a regular guest at the cottage in question for 3 summers. She did not see it as a piece of property. She saw it as her home, away from home. Mark stopped pacing and slammed his glass onto the sideboard. He demanded to know how the palace legal team had allowed this to happen. He wanted to know why no one had flagged the codicil before it reached the desk of the king. He was furious. He felt that his family's position in the household was being undermined by a girl who had no role in the direct management of the crown. The queen entered the room through the side door. She looked exhausted. She had spent the morning in meetings with her staff. She had been told that the legal validity of the claim was, at the very least, a significant headache. She did not sit down. She stood by the table and listened to her brother vent his frustrations. She knew he was right to be angry. She also knew that shouting would not solve the problem. She told them that the king was in a difficult position. She explained that he could not simply dismiss the claim. He was bound by the laws of probate. If he tried to act, he would be challenged in court. That would bring the entire issue into the light. It would invite the press to examine every corner of the private estate. She said that she was not going to give them the ammunition to do that. Annabelle looked up from the paper. She asked if the queen was prepared to just give it up. She argued that the cottage was a symbol of their connection to the center of power. If they lost it, they would be seen as vulnerable. She believed that the rest of the household would interpret the loss as a signal that the queen's family was losing its influence. She urged the queen to push back. The tension in the room spiked. It was clear that the family was not going to go quietly. They had become accustomed to the lifestyle of the palace. They had formed their own network of support and influence. They saw Lady Louise as a threat to the world they had carefully built. They were not fighting for a cottage. They were fighting for their relevance. The mystery was the source of the leak. How did the family know the details of the codicil so quickly? The queen looked at her brother. She asked if he had been speaking to the staff in the private office. Mark looked away. He had been on the phone with his contacts all morning. He had been trying to find a way to discredit the document. He had been trying to find a reason to reject the claim as fraudulent. The queen realized that her own family was making things worse. Their aggressive reaction was being reported back to the king. It was making the queen look defensive. It was making her look as though she was protecting her own interests at the expense of the late queen's final wishes. She told her brother to stop his inquiries. She told him that she would handle the situation through the proper channels. They did not listen. They had their own ideas. They began to draft a series of emails to the press. They wanted to plant stories about the history of the cottage. They wanted to frame it as a property that had been neglected by the late queen and saved by their efforts. They were trying to build a public case against the inheritance. They were playing with fire. The fact is that the queen's family was operating on an outdated set of assumptions. They believed that they could still influence the narrative through their old connections. They did not understand that the palace had changed. The new management under the prince was not interested in maintaining the old networks of favor and influence. They were interested in compliance and procedure. The more noise the queen's family made, the more they alienated the very people who were managing the legal file. The resolution of the afternoon was a fragile truce. The queen convinced them to wait for the king's official response. She promised them that she would fight for their right to remain on the estate. She did not tell them that she was already preparing for a different outcome. She was a realist. She knew that if the codicil held up in court, there would be no way to keep the cottage. A new mystery emerged as the family left the room. Who had provided the codicil to Lady Louise in the first place? The The solicitor who had held the vault had been a loyal servant to the late Queen for 40 years. He would not have shared the document without a reason. The Queen realized that there was someone in the inner circle who was working against her, someone who wanted to see her influence decline. She sat in the chair her sister had vacated. She looked at the fireplace. She felt as though the ground were shifting beneath her. She had navigated many crises in her time at the palace. She had weathered scandals, public disapproval, and internal palace politics. But this felt different. This was a challenge to the very foundation of her position. She stood up and walked to the door. She had to find out who was behind the disclosure. She had to know who was pulling the strings. She walked into the hallway and called her head of security. She told him that she wanted a full background check on every person who had access to the vault. She was starting her own investigation. The war was no longer in the shadows. It was out in the open. The legal labyrinth, a battle of statutes. The courtroom in Edinburgh was quiet. It lacked the grandeur of the London High Courts. It was a functional space, wood-paneled and dimly lit. Two solicitors sat at the front table. They were reviewing a thick binder of documents. It was the Scottish Land Registry file on the cottage. They were looking for the exact language of the title deed. They needed to see if the property had been transferred to the private trust of the monarchy, or if it remained under the personal ownership of the late sovereign. One solicitor tapped his pen on a specific page. It was a statute from 1965. It dealt with the way land could be bequeathed within the royal estate. It was complex, written in archaic legal language. He noted that the statute had been amended in 2005. This change was critical. It clarified that personal bequests of land could override general estate management agreements. This was the opening that Lady Louise needed. The other solicitor sat back in his chair. He rubbed his eyes. He pointed out that the king's legal team would argue that the cottage was essential to the operational security of the estate. They would claim that granting it to a private individual would create a security risk. They would also suggest that the codicil was never intended to be activated in the way Louise was attempting. They had a mountain of administrative precedents to back their side. They knew that this was not a simple matter of a will. It was a test of the monarch's power to control his own assets versus the individual rights of a family member. If the court ruled in favor of the granddaughter, it would set a massive legal precedent. Every other property on the royal estates would suddenly be open to similar claims from other family members. The entire structure of royal landholding could be threatened. The tension in the room was sharp. They were aware that the eyes of the palace were on them. They were being watched by the legal advisors to the Prince of Wales, who were already drafting their own counterbriefs. They were also under scrutiny from the Queen's own lawyers, who wanted the case dismissed as quickly as possible to avoid a public trial. The solicitors were working in a vacuum of political pressure. The mystery was the origin of the 2005 amendment. It had been passed with very little public debate. Records showed it was introduced during a period of intense restructuring of the royal finances. No one could quite recall who had pushed for that specific change. It was a technical tweak, seemingly insignificant at the time, yet it was now the pivot point for the biggest internal crisis in decades. One of the solicitors went to the library in the basement. He started digging through the archived legislative notes. He spent 4 hours going through boxes of paper. He finally found a memo dated from the summer of 2004. It was signed by a junior aide who worked for the late Queen. The memo referenced the need for greater flexibility in land transfers for future generations. It was the smoking gun. He rushed back to the room. He showed the memo to his colleague. They realized that the late Queen had anticipated this type of scenario. She had not just forgotten to manage the land. She had intentionally created a legal path for her family to claim their own space on the estates. It was a brilliant, long-term play. It showed a side of the Queen that few had seen. The strategist who was always 10 steps ahead. The facts were changing. The claim was no longer just a request. It was a legally prepared inheritance. The team for Lady Louise felt a surge of energy. They had the law, the precedent, and the historical intent. They felt confident that they could hold their ground against the pressure from the king's office. They began to outline the argument for the first hearing. The atmosphere in the room shifted from anxious to focused. They began to draft the formal petition for the court. They used precise, clear language. They wanted to make sure that the king's team could not twist their words. They knew that the opposition would look for every possible loophole. They had to be perfect. A new mystery started to form. Why had the Queen trusted this aide with such a volatile secret? The aide had left the household in 2006 and had lived a very quiet life in the countryside ever since. They searched for his name in the modern directory. He had passed away 3 years ago. The secret had been kept by a ghost. They felt a strange sense of honor. They were the ones to finally reveal the Queen's plan. They were finishing the job she had started. They knew that the case would go on for months. They knew it would be a media circus. But they also knew that they were on the right side of the law. They packed up their files and walked out into the cool evening air. The city was busy with the usual traffic. People were rushing home. No one in the street had any idea that a legal battle was underway that could change the future of the monarchy. They were just living their lives. The lawyers looked at the bustle of the city and realized the scale of the task ahead. They had to simplify their case for the public. They had to make sure that the people understood the core of the issue. They reached the office and closed the door behind them. They had a long night ahead. They had to prepare the final documents for the filing. They were ready. The labyrinth was wide and dark, but they had a map. They were going to walk through it, one step at a time. The battle of statutes was officially underway. They turned on the lamp and started to type. The King's paralysis. Between two worlds. The King stood in the center of his study at Sandringham. It was late in the evening. A single lamp illuminated the heavy desk where the petition from the solicitors rested. He had spent 3 hours staring at the document. He traced the signature of his mother at the bottom. He felt the weight of the moment. He was the sovereign. He was also a husband. The two roles were colliding in a way he had never imagined possible. Outside, the wind rattled the window pane. It was a cold, lonely sound. The King walked to the sideboard and poured a glass of water. His hand did not shake, but his movements were stiff. He knew that any decision he made would be final. If he chose to reject the claim, he would be publicly defying the clear, documented wish of his predecessor. If he accepted it, he would effectively be evicting his wife's closest relatives from their long-term retreat. He thought about the meeting he had held with his lawyers that afternoon. They had been clear. The case for Lady Louise was built on a solid foundation of legislative history. They had warned him that a court battle would expose the inner workings of the royal estates to a level of scrutiny he had spent years trying to avoid. They had advised a settlement. They suggested he offer the granddaughter a different property or a financial payout. He sat back in his chair. He knew that was not what she wanted. He had spoken to her briefly on the phone the day before. Her voice had been calm. She had not asked for money. She had not asked for a compromise. She had simply asked for the cottage. She had reminded him of the summers they spent there as a family. She had invoked the memory of his own mother. He felt the trap closing around him. The tension in the household was reaching a breaking point. The Queen's family had been calling his private office incessantly. They were demanding that he use his royal prerogative to block the legal challenge. They were using every argument in the book. They spoke of loyalty. They spoke of the disruption to the current operations. They were desperate. They knew that their place in the house was tied to the status quo. The King realized that he was being isolated. He looked at the lists of names on his desk. He saw the people he had once trusted. They were all aligned with one side or the other. There was no neutral ground left. He was the monarch, yet he was being told what to do by his advisors, his family, and the ghost of the law. He had never felt less in control of his own reign. A mystery gnawed at him. Who was advising Lady Louise? She did not have the experience to orchestrate such a sophisticated legal maneuver on her own. He suspected that there was a power behind her. He wondered if his own son had played a role in the situation. He wondered if this was part of the wider plan to restructure the entire monarchy from the bottom up. He decided to call for an inquiry into the legal team working for his niece. He picked up the phone. He dialed a private number. He reached out to a trusted confidant who had served the crown for decades. He asked for a full report on the lawyers handling the claim. He wanted to know who was paying their fees. He wanted to know if this was a family dispute or a political operation. He was searching for a thread to pull to unravel the entire scheme. The investigation would take time. The King had to buy himself that time. He decided to issue a temporary stay on any further action regarding the cottage. He would claim that he needed to conduct a full review of the royal archive before making a final decision. It was a stalling tactic, but it was all he had. He had to be the monarch who considered all the facts. He had to play for space. The facts remained, however. The legal challenge was already filed. The court would expect a response within a set period. His stay would only go so far. He was building a wall against a rising tide. He looked at the clock on the mantel. It was almost midnight. He felt the weight of the years pressing down on him. He was tired of the game. He was tired of the shifting loyalties and the hidden agendas. He walked to the door and looked out into the long, dark hallway of the palace. He heard the muffled sound of a guard patrolling the grounds. He wondered if they knew the history of the house they were protecting. He wondered if they knew that the legacy was being picked apart by the very people who were supposed to be its stewards. He felt a sudden, sharp clarity. He was the king. It was time for him to stop being an observer. The mystery resolved itself in his mind. It did not matter who was advising his niece. It did not matter who was leaking the documents. What mattered was the integrity of the crown. He realized that the only way to save the monarchy was to prioritize the law above his personal relationships. He had to act with absolute transparency, regardless of who it hurt. He would make the decision based on the evidence alone. He returned to his desk and began to write a note. He would not send it to the press. He would send it directly to the lawyers for both sides. He would acknowledge the validity of the claim. He would state his intention to comply with the law, provided that the legitimacy of the codicil could be verified by an independent third party. It was a gamble. It would force the Queen's family to accept the reality of the situation. The room felt lighter. He had made a choice. He had stepped out of the middle and placed himself on the side of the law. He knew that the morning would bring the reaction. He knew that his wife would be furious. He knew that the advisors would panic. He did not care. He had found his footing. He sat in the quiet of the night, waiting for the dawn. The king was ready to face the storm. The wider stakes, a dynasty at risk. The breakfast room at Windsor was silent. The usual bustle of staff was absent. Only the ticking of a grandfather clock broke the quiet. The king sat at the head of the table. He was looking at a pile of briefing papers. They detailed the potential fallout of the cottage dispute. Every department head had submitted a report. Each one warned of the same outcome. The public was losing faith in the ability of the crown to manage its own house. The facts were cold and unavoidable. The Scottish legal challenge had triggered a series of secondary audits. Other properties were now being scrutinized. The public wanted to know who held the titles to the land. They wanted to know why family members were occupying residences that were supposedly part of the royal estate. Transparency had become the new standard. The monarchy could no longer hide behind the veil of private inheritance. Tension filled the room when the Queen walked in. She did not look at the king. She poured a cup of tea and sat at the far end of the table. She had spent the night meeting with her advisors. She knew that the king had sent the note to the lawyers. She viewed it as a betrayal. She felt that he had abandoned her family in the name of a legal process that could have been managed behind closed doors. The king did not look up. He knew the anger was there. He also knew he could not bridge the gap. He was looking at a chart that showed the decline in monarchical approval ratings over the last 6 months. It was a steep downward trend. The people were tired of the internal fighting. They were tired of the reports of leaks, administrative purges, and now, a battle over property. The crown was becoming a symbol of discord. The mystery was how the public had gotten such detailed information. The briefings were confidential. The legal filings were still in the early stages. Yet, the newspapers were reporting facts that only people inside the private office should have known. The king realized that the leak was coming from his own inner circle. He was being betrayed by the people who were supposed to be the most loyal to the throne. He looked at the security advisor who was standing by the door. He asked for the latest report on the digital communication logs. The advisor shook his head. He said that the monitoring was inconclusive. The information was being leaked through analog channels. It was being printed, copied, and carried out of the building. It was a classic low-tech operation. It meant that the security team was fighting a ghost. The facts were that the monarchy was effectively being dismantled from the inside out. Every move the king made to stabilize the situation was countered by a new leak. The property dispute had simply provided the focal point for a much larger struggle for influence. The house was being pushed toward a tipping point. The stability of the House of Windsor was no longer guaranteed. The Queen stood up. She walked to the window. She looked out at the courtyard. She saw a group of tourists taking photos of the gate. They looked happy. They were the people who supported the monarchy without question. She felt a sudden, sharp ache of regret. She knew that if they saw the reality of the situation, their support would vanish. She was fighting for a world that was already disappearing. The mystery of the true agenda remained. Who was the architect of this chaos? It was not Lady Louise. She was a pawn in a much bigger game. The king considered the possibilities. Was it a faction within the government? Was it a group of disgruntled former staff? Or was it his own son, looking for a way to rewrite the rules of the monarchy? The question hung in the air, unanswered. He turned back to the table. He saw the report on the impact of the cottage dispute on the international perception of the crown. It suggested that foreign investors were pausing their support for royal charities. The instability was starting to cost money. The crown could afford the criticism, but it could not afford the loss of its financial base. The stakes had just been raised again. The king decided to take a drastic step. He would announce a full public review of all royal property holdings. He would invite an independent commission to audit every residence. He would expose the entire estate to the light of day. He would stop the leaks by making the information public before it could be sold to the press. It was a move of pure desperation. It was his last, best play. He looked at the queen. He told her what he was planning. She did not say a word. She walked to the door. She knew that if he did this, the era of royal privacy would be over. The family would lose the last of its secrets. She opened the door and walked out, leaving him alone in the room. He felt the weight of the crown. It was heavier than it had ever been. The ticking of the clock seemed to grow louder. He felt the shift in the room. The air was colder. He had just declared war on the past. He was going to turn the palace into an open book. He was going to sacrifice the mystery to save the throne. He picked up his pen and began to outline the announcement. The dynasty was at risk, and this was the price of survival. The battle for the cottage has ignited a fire that threatens to consume the very foundations of the monarchy. By choosing transparency over tradition, the king has forced a reckoning that will strip away the layers of privacy protecting the House of Windsor. With the Queen's family in open revolt and the public demanding accountability, the path forward is fraught with unprecedented risk. Has this bold move saved the dynasty, or has it handed the keys to the kingdom to the court of public opinion?